if you've not heard Brent Johnson, you're going to love this guy. He runs an amazing firm, but mostly what he does is teaches us about milkshakes and the dollar and where it is. And how many of you have watched Brent before? How many of you have not? You're in for a treat. Please welcome our good friend, Mr. Brent Johnson.
Morning, everybody. My dog is in the back of the room, so if he starts barking, I apologize. Give me 1 second, I just got to get set up here. Okay, great. This is not coming on for some reason. Technical difficulties. Well, this is embarrassing. Okay, I'll wing it. Okay, so my name is Brent Johnson. I appreciate everybody being here today. How many people came to the conference last year and heard me speak? How many have heard me speak about the dollar milkshake theory at some point or another? Okay. Well, I'm not going to speak too much about it today, but essentially, what I think when you hear about the dollar milkshake theory, what it essentially is, oh, here we go, hold on, sorry. Yeah, so essentially what it is the dollar milkshake theory, it's really not one thing. It's really a framework for how I see a global financial crisis or a currency crisis and a debt crisis playing out. It's a framework for how I see that going. And I'm not going to talk about the milkshake theory too much today, but as essentially, I believe that it's in this type of an environment where global capital and money from around the world will still flow to the dollar and to the United States. Despite all the dollar's flaws and despite all the shortcomings of the USA, I still think we will be the port in the storm or where people seek safety. And so despite all the problems that everybody knows about, I think the idea that the dollar is going to zero and you need to get out of it is not necessarily correct. As a result, I continue to think it's the strong dollar that's going to bring down the monetary system and not a weak dollar. I think if the Fed loses control, which a lot of people think the Fed will lose control, I think that means the dollar is going higher, not lower. And I also think that the more the Fed prints, quote unquote, the higher the dollar will ultimately go. And mainly because we're not the only ones in the bad situation. The whole world is essentially in the same place. And whatever drastic measures we have to take, or the Fed has to take, the rest of the world's going to have to do it to even in greater extent. Long story short, despite all the effort to do so, I do not think the world has decoupled from the U.S. or the U.S. dollar. And I think if the U.S. gets sick, it'll take the rest of the world with it. And if I eventually think we're going to get into a point where the dollar and gold rise together, and they will be the two last currencies standing, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I think, I think there are a lot of people out there who probably disagree with me on this, and that's okay. Some think we're quickly moving to a de-dollarized world already. Others think there's no reason to own gold if the dollar is going to go higher. Others think that the U.S. is not the cleanest dirty shirt and that the world has already decoupled economically and that emerging markets will rise as the U.S. weakens. But if I had to choose just one chart or piece of information to back up my theory, I would use this one. Despite all the QE programs, despite the QE programs, despite all the helicopter money, despite the twin deficits, despite the swap lines that we've extended to other nations, despite the social unrest we've seen right here in the United States, despite the innumerable predictions that the dollar is on its death's door, it's still 20% higher than it was 13 years ago when all these crazy programs started. And I think it's this fact that many people just have a hard time accepting. I mean, everybody just knows the dollar has to go down. And so the fact that it's going higher is driving them crazy. And that's why I've titled the name of this presentation, Psycho. Because when I look around and I see people talking about different events and things on the news, I feel like people are just absolutely losing their minds. And the dollar going higher is just part of it. And this is bad because psychology and your state of mind is going to be one of the most important factors that determine whether or not you're going to get through the next few years and the next few challenges that we have. So, like I said, I see it all over the place, and it really kind of makes me laugh. Like, whether it's people on the left who still cannot just accept the fact that Trump was president, right? They just can't get over it. Or the people on the right who just can't accept that CNN and CNBC are still in business. Or the gold bugs who cannot believe that even though they got everything they ever wanted, gold still hasn't broken out. Or the laser-eyed crypto hornets who have been glued to their screens for the last couple of months in absolute disbelief that the price keeps falling. Or even the dollar bears who keep telling me that every day the U.S. empire is going to fall. But either way, people are just keep losing their minds. Now, my goal today is not to convince you that my milkshake theory is correct and that it's definitely going to play out. I'm not here to prove to you that I'm right. My goal is really pretty simple, but it's also hard. And that is to just get you guys to think and kind of challenge your own assumptions and not go crazy when you do it. And if you can do that, I think you'll enjoy this presentation. But I think, some of the things you're going to agree with me with, and some of them you're going to disagree with me. And in some of the times, I know you're absolutely going to know for certain that I'm wrong. And that's where we're going to get to Hugh Hendry here, my friend who is a former hedge fund manager and just a great thinker. During the height of the European sovereign debt crisis, after listening to this famous economist Jeffrey Sachs drone on about how everything was going to be okay and the governments would all take care of us, Hugh very calmly looked at the audience and said, "I recommend that you panic." And when he said that, it was really funny because he was saying that things are so bad that the leaders like Jeffrey are so incompetent that you should panic. But when he said it, he was totally cool. He wasn't upset, didn't yell. He remained very calm. And the reason he remained calm is he had already thought through everything. He was prepared for the chaos. And so I'm hoping today that some of my ideas don't cause any outrage or panic. I don't want you to go running out of the room. But if they do, I hope we can discuss it afterwards very calmly like Hugh here. Now, I think one of the reasons that are contributing factors to today's insanity is the fact that our minds are telling us one thing should be happening, while simultaneously trying to comprehend the realities that are coming out of our computer screens and our TVs that are in opposition to what we think should be happening. The cognitive dissonance is driving many people mad. And my guess is that many of you, just like often happens to me, often suffer from holding two competing theories or ideas in your head at the same time. This one is one of my favorites. This is a good example. I had this conversation about a year ago, and it absolutely killed me. I was talking to a guy, and he was saying that there was absolutely nothing the Fed could do to tame inflation and get prices to come down. And I said, well, what if they raise interest rates? He said, well, that would cause a recession and prices would fall. Now, if you think that the Fed is absolutely incapable of handling inflation, then why would you be worried about them raising interest rates? I mean, the contradiction here, it just made me laugh. But I think it's important to kind of understand when you're contradicting yourself. Here's another one. This is one of my recent favorites. It says the USA uses the US dollar as a weapon by forcing the rest of the world to use its domestic currency to buy commodities. Everybody familiar with this? How many people agree with this? Show of hands. Okay, so there's a few. Well, the interesting thing is you don't have to do too much to change it. All I have to do is change two words: Russia and the ruble. But when Russia does it, they just started doing it. The exact same thing that we've been doing for a long time. But they started to do it, and they are like, these super 3D chess-playing geniuses. But when the U.S. does it, it's an example of a dying empire who's desperately trying to hold on to their, kingdom. But it's the exact same action. But it's the emotion involved in it that makes you view one of them one way and the other one the other way. And I think you need to kind of try as much as you can to remove the emotion, remove the morality, and just focus on objectively what's being said. And I think that'll help everybody going forward. Okay, so since we're now getting into the psychological part of investing in markets, which I think is maybe the most important part, I'm going to refer to a few of my favorite movies involving psychos. namely Martin McDonagh's Seven Psychopaths, the Hitchcock classic Psycho, and Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, which featured the Joker, who I think we all agree is a psychopath in his own right. There's also 3 books I'm going to refer to. One is, and I recommend everybody read these books. They're absolutely fascinating, and I think they will help you think through some things. But one of them is by a guy named Robert Burton. It's called On Being Certain. Another one is Kevin Dutton's The Wisdom of Psychopaths. And the third one is David Eagleman's Incognito. And they all made a really big impression on me. Now, going back to Seven Psychopaths, and I love this movie. If you haven't seen it, it's very dark comedy, but you should watch it. But very early on, Marty is explaining to his friend that he's writing this novel about psychopaths. And he says, yeah, I'm kind of sick of all these stereotypical Hollywood murder scumbag type psychopath movies. I don't want it to be one more film about guys with guns in their hands. I want it overall to be about love and peace, but it still has to be about seven psychopaths. And so that's kind of how I want the rest of this presentation to be. Again, my goal is not to convince you of anything. My goal is to help you kind of keep your head when everybody else is losing theirs during this crazy time that we're all living through. I want it to be about communication, understanding, and non-emotional, objective analysis. But don't get me wrong, we're definitely be talking about some real psychopaths along the way. And I think this is such a good topic because in our society as a whole, we have a fascination with psychopaths. You know, some common traits include persuasiveness, charm, manipulation of others, lack of remorse, and a grandiose sense of self-worth. And they come on both sides. This is not one side versus the other. They're everywhere. And whether they're characters put forth by Hollywood or the people that we interact with or deal with in real life, they always seem to draw us in. Perhaps it's nothing more than what Winston Churchill once said, and that great and good are seldom found in the same man or woman. Even Aristotle once proclaimed that there was never a genius that didn't have a tincture of madness. And in his book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, Kevin Dutton theorized that one of the reasons we're fascinated by psychopaths is that we all love illusions, by things that appear on the surface to be normal, yet upon closer inspection turn out to be anything but. For example, take a look at this picture. I need a show of hands. How many soccer balls do you see? Count the soccer ball. Focus on the soccer balls and count the soccer balls. How many do you see? How many think there's 5? Show of hands. How many think 6? How many think 7? Well, you guys are all pretty smart. There is, in fact, 6 soccer balls up there. But while you were looking at the soccer balls, how many of you guys noticed that he also had 6 fingers on each hand? And that's kind of what psychopaths are like. You know, they're not technically hiding anything. It's right out there for you to see. But they use their psychological camouflage and, to distract us from the blatant truth that's right in front of our eyes. Now, Dutton went on to, he actually did this big study in the United Kingdom where he polled the entire labor force to try to assess which characteristics of psychopathy were found in different job titles. It turns out that some of the most highly successful people throughout society have very similar characteristics with psychopaths. Although there's 2 professions that I'm pretty sure are somehow been left off this list. And that brings us back to the 7 psychopaths. Or maybe the better way to call them would be the 7 voting members of the FOMC. Now, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a smaller group of people who have had a bigger negative impact on a larger group of people than anybody in the world. But the possible exception would perhaps be the presidents of the G7 nations. Trudeau, Macron, Biden, Draghi, Johnson, Kishida, and Schultz. These countries and these central banks have essentially been in charge of Western civilization and much of the global world order for the last 50, 60 years, maybe even the last century. And their policies have now led us to the borders of a simultaneous food and energy crisis. And actually, we're probably closer to a war now than we've been at any time I've been alive. So this is their leadership. And, this guy, he hasn't held a job outside of government for 50 years, but he thinks he understands economics to explain that the only reason we have inflation is because of Putin. Psychopaths, right? I mean, look at some of these characteristics that have happened. Between these groups, we've got profligate spending, exponential growth of debt, misallocation of assets, social and financial inequality, and now, like I said, we've got this simultaneous food and energy crisis. And yet, despite all of this, trying to get a hint of responsibility or remorse from the leaders who have brought us here, it's really hard to find it. And it kind of reminds me of this guy. This guy was named John Wayne Gacy. He's a very famous psychopathic serial killer. And he said during his trial, all I'm really guilty of is running a cemetery without a license. And so I think that sums those previous groups up pretty well. But this guy named Alan Harrington in 1972 came up with this new theory. And he basically said that with regards to human evolution, that psychopaths constituted a dangerous new breed of human, a psychological superhero free from the shackles and of anxiety and remorse. So, I certainly don't think of central bankers and politicians as an evolved species, but I do put them at the top of the food chain. And I think this is where we have to be really careful when the critics of the central bankers and the politicians start thinking of them as morons, buffoons, or idiots, because I don't think that's the case. I think they're actually extremely smart. But these people have been hiding in plain sight for years. Not only that, they've convinced large portions of the society that they're on our side and that they're our protectors, rather than us, taking responsibility for ourselves. And as such, they're the source of much of the cognitive dissonance that's affecting people today. Many years ago, the central bankers started going to work on the bond market. And they did this because they wanted to get interest rates much lower. And interest rates are really nothing more than the price of money. And the reason they wanted the price of money lower, because of the knock-on effects. And the knock-on effects are basically specifically the rise in housing prices, real estate, or equities, just assets in general. They want to push asset prices higher. And as a result, we've seen these huge asset bubbles around the world and big real estate bubbles in the United States, Canada, Australia. And this has led to moral hazard across many parts of the financial markets. I thought Simon Mikhailovich said it really well a couple years ago. He said, by breaking the price mechanism, central banks have unleashed the financial cynicism. Investors can see the price of everything, but the value of nothing. And these policies have now led us, due to a combination of the low rates, the stimulus from COVID, and the supply chain breakdowns, we're getting record inflation readings all over the world. And the problem is because the central banks have been behind the curve on this, it's kind of gotten to a point where they have to address it because citizens are now losing purchasing power and they're starting to get restless. If you look back through history, virtually every revolution that's ever taken place or any challenge to the existing government has always taken place during high levels of inflation. And the reason is because when people are warm and, fed, they're typically pretty happy. There's no reason to go out and revolt if you feel good. But if you're cold and you're hungry and you don't think things are going well, that's when you start to act out. And so I think that, so at this point, the central banks are having to react to this kind of the levels of inflation that we've had. And that brings us to the cognitive dissonance of the Fed critic. I talk to many people who will just say, how can the Fed possibly raise rates? And the thing that I would say is it wasn't that long ago that the consensus view was that everyone was absolutely certain about it, last summer even, was that the Fed would never stop QE, governments would never stop sending stimulus checks, and they would never do quantitative tightening. My guess is that many people in this room held that exact same view. But here we are today, and QE has stopped. The checks are no longer coming, and they have embarked on quantitative tightening. The very thing that everyone was so certain of 12 months ago is already taking place today. And now it seems to me, how do I go back? Apologies. Oh. Now, it seems to me that the general consensus that the Fed will not be able to continue raising rates, and that at the pace that they have hinted. And there are many out there who are absolutely certain that if they do continue to raise rates, it will cause a recession. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is wrong. I actually tend to agree with this point of view. But what I want to focus on is the certainty that I know many people have had in the belief that the Fed cannot continue to do this. And after being so certain about them never stopping QE, about never stopping checks, about never doing quantitative tightening, only to be proven wrong. What provides the confidence to be so certain now that they can't continue to raise? Something's wrong with my clicker here. I don't know what's going on. Is there a way to go backwards? Okay, hold on. I apologize. Okay, so the point I want to make here is that for many years, if you thought the central banks were reckless holding down rates, then you shouldn't have a problem with them raising rates now. If you believe in free markets and you believe inflationary pressures want to move rates higher, then you shouldn't have a problem with them doing now. Or if you think central bankers are powerless to stop inflation, like we were talking about earlier, then there's nothing to worry and there's no way they can bring prices down, then you shouldn't be worried about a recession if they do raise rates. Because, again, you're kind of arguing with yourself here. Now, I'm not saying one way is right or wrong. I'm just saying you need to really be honest with yourself of what you believe and what you don't as you're kind of thinking through the decisions that you're making. An American neurologist named Robert Burton wrote a fascinating book called On Being Certain, which, again, I highly recommend you read this. His basic question that he tries to answer in the book is, what does it mean to be convinced? Because I think a lot of us are trying to get convinced of something in today. And it seems simple, the answer, that you go out, you study the evidence, and you come to a decision, right? Well, no. He found out it's actually not that simple. And in fact, modern biology is saying otherwise. Studies show that, despite how certainty feels, it's neither a conscious choice nor even a thought process. Certainty and similar states of knowing what we know arise out of an involuntary brain mechanism, like love or anger. I mean, how many of us, you don't get to choose who you fall in love with. It's really hard to control whether you're angry or not. Well, it's the same way with certainty. They don't function independently of reason. It's kind of your feeling of being certain is kind of an involuntary decision that your brain makes. He goes on to say the feeling of knowing is the reward for both proven and unproven thoughts. It's learning's best friend and mental flexibility's worst enemy. Now, so that just shows you, like, trying to get conviction on something while also allowing for yourself to be wrong is one of the hardest things to do. But let's stay here for a minute on the idea that interest rates will throw us back into a recession. Like, how do we know this? Why are we so certain? Is it the result of much study and actually factually correct? Or, as Burton suggested, do our feelings of knowing come from somewhere involuntarily? Are we really seeing things clearly? Or are we just parroting something because somebody we think is very smart said that, and they're suggesting it to us? In his book, Incognito, David Engelman says it's very hard to be completely objective because, as strange as it sounds, our expectations influence what we see. To take an example, we'll take this picture here. If you don't have any prior expectation of what this is, it's just a bunch of black and white blobs. There kind of has to be a match between what you expect to see and what you actually see for it to become visible. In other words, and this is the kicker, vision has to be predicted. It has to be learned. But if I give you just a hint, this allows the image to take on a completely new meaning. You can see the beard. Can everybody see the bearded figure in here? How many people could see it before I went to this slide? So some of you were able to see it. But once you have the hint, even if you take it away, you can see it every time. You don't need the hint any longer. But to see it originally, you needed the hint. Now, do you really think that the central bankers and the politicians are unaware of this phenomenon? Of course they're not. Now, think of that in conjunction with something as similar as or simple as forward guidance or where they tell you things are headed. They tell you those things because they want you to go there or they want you to believe that. They're giving you the vision. And so, again, it's not that they're necessarily wrong, but they're trying to lead you down a path, and you need to determine whether that path is correct or not. Now, this is not really a recent discovery. 150 years ago, this guy named Hermann von Helmholtz, who was a kind of a legend in physics and medicine, psychology, he concluded that the brain must make assumptions about incoming data, and that these assumptions are based on our previous experience. In other words, given little information, our brain will use its best guess to turn something into reality. And this is like why it's the most important thing for fighter pilots is to trust your instruments. Because if you trust your senses and your eyes rather than your instruments, your eyes will tell you these big lies. And if you believe them instead of your instruments, you'll crash into the mountain. So going back to interest rates, we've been in this 40-year bull market for bonds and have only seen interest rates fall, other than the last, call it, 6 months. And most don't have any experience with rates rising. If we don't have any experience with rates rising, and vision needs to be predicted in order to actually see, how do we know what we think is going to happen is real? How do we know that's really, why are we certain that's what's going to happen if we have no experience with it? How do we know that the hint that's being given to us is correct, rather than just a bunch of blobs up on a screen? Would we really be able to see a clear picture of what's going to happen, even if the picture was right in front of us? It's really tough to figure out. But now there's the interesting thing to me is that now there are men and women who are heading fixed income trading desks all over the world who have known nothing but quantitative easing. These guys and girls have been successful 10, 20, 30-year careers who have never seen interest rates go up more than a couple quarters in a row. So they have no experience with dealing with sustained higher interest rates. But these are the people that are writing research reports, sitting on investment committees, and allocating assets. These are the experts that are telling you what's going to happen. And yet, if rates continue to rise, they have zero experience with it. So why are you so certain that they're right? Again, I don't know whether they're right or not, but I think it's interesting that everybody's just absolutely certain that if the central banks continue to raise interest rates, that we're going to get this massive recession. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying I'm not convinced of it. But if you think about it, despite the recent fall in price, we're kind of at 5,000-year lows in interest rates. Is it really so hard to believe that it might be time for them to go higher? I was in a meeting recently with about 20 different hedge fund managers, pension fund managers, family office investment heads, and there was a couple presentations showing how a recession was right around the corner and that U.S. Treasury rates are actually destined to come back down. And they were very well done and extremely convincing, and to be totally honest, I agree with them. I think that's probably what's going to happen. The only problem I had is when I looked around the room, everyone else was nodding in agreement. I even asked if anyone disagreed, and nobody did. And so that kind of sent off a bunch of alarm bells in my head. So, again, how do we know and why do we believe that interest rates are going to rise? Well, why do I think interest rates are going to rise? Well, like I said, I don't necessarily think that they are. But my point is it's not a zero probability event. And I feel like a lot of people are treating it like a zero probability event. The only thing I'm certain of is that nothing is certain. So don't get too married to your ideas. Try to remain flexible, especially if you're certain. That's the time to be the most mentally flexible, was when you're absolutely certain. Now, I actually do, like I said, I actually think interest rates very well go lower, potentially even negative. But I'm very much keeping an open mind on this. And what if this is correct? What if interest rates do go lower? What if interest rates don't rise? What if the central banks are able to keep rates low? Well, that's where this guy comes in. In one of his most revealing scenes in The Dark Knight, he says, "You know what I noticed? Nobody panics when things are going according to plan, even when the plan is horrifying. If tomorrow I told you to the press that a gangbanger would get shot or a truckload of soldiers would be blown up, nobody panics because it's all part of the plan." Well, I guess that's kind of what I want to focus on here. What if they are? What if the central banks are successful? Right? What if they don't fail? Well, Japan has had extremely low rates for decades. Japanese banks, pension funds, and insurance companies are loaded to the gills with bonds that were purchased at either zero rates or negative interest rates. Now, recently, interest rates in Japan rose only 25 basis points. And this set off many alarm bells in the Bank of Japan and in the Japanese markets. And what is the BOJ's plan to deal with this? Okay, we'll do yield curve control. We'll buy as many bonds as we need to get those rates back down. And that it did. It actually calmed the markets a little bit, and it calmed the bond markets. But if you think about it, the plan is terrifying. It's absolutely insane, especially if you're a Japanese citizen, because the outlet becomes the currency. And as such, the yen has now broken a 40-year line of support. It's down 15% year to date and 20% over the last year. That is a huge move for a major currency. The yen is probably the second or third most used currency in the entire world. So for it to be down that much, it's horrifying. Not only that, but it's the knock-on effects that this has had. Now, this chart is a little bit old, but this yen weakness will have knock-on effects of its own. What I'm showing here is the correlation between the Japanese yen and the yuan. Now, the white line is the yen. When the white line is going up, that's the yen weakening. And what it shows is the last two times the yen weakened, the yuan ended up having to weaken as well. Now, the two little red squares on the left show where the Chinese yuan weakened. And it doesn't look like that big of a deal because it wasn't that big of a move. But when you understand that at the time that those moves happened, the Japanese currency was pegged and was not supposed to move at all, or the Chinese currency was pegged and was not supposed to move at all, then it becomes more of a big deal. And if you look and see what's happening now, the yen has dropped at a faster rate than just about any other time. And now the yuan has started to fall in price. Now, the reason that's important is because China is having a huge problem of their own. They're having to deal with both deflation in their huge real estate market and inflation because they have to import a lot of their foods and a lot of their energy, which are priced in dollars. And you're starting to see now Japan is competing with them with a lower priced currency. So Japanese goods are cheaper than Chinese goods, which makes their top line revenue come down even more. And you're starting to see it play out in the Chinese currency. If the Chinese currency has to fall significantly or gets devalued, that is going to send a deflationary shockwave to the rest of the world. So it's all of this stuff has huge implications and huge knock-on effects. But what about the plans out of Europe and the European Central Bank? Talk about cognitive dissonance. Their bright idea is to raise rates and do QE purchases at the same time. It boggles the mind. But as crazy as this plan sounds, Lagarde, who's the head of the ECB, she said she's not even going to give us any details about how they do it. And talk about a psychopath. Perhaps this is not totally surprising considering that she's not going to give these details because really this is their own version of yield curve controlled or yield caps. It's essentially QE to infinity. So this is the very definition of a terrifying plan. And yet the European sovereign bond markets initially stabilized when this first came out. But make no mistake, the chart of the euro doesn't look all that much different than the chart of the yen. It just broke 40-year support or 30-year support. And remember, when the euro and the yen are falling, what does that mean? That means the dollar's going up because it's the inverse. And so if these two currencies have horrible setups for their currencies to fall, then by the inverse rule, the dollar has an amazing setup for a big rise. And here, what I did is I just took the five major currencies for the world. And the reality is that although the Bank of England is starting to tighten as well, only the U.S. is doing aggressively tighter monetary policy. The Chinese yuan, they're still doing easing. The yen is still doing easing. The euro is still doing easing. If you think about these countries and the currencies like a bank, and let's say that you move to a new city and you have to go choose a bank. And you go to one bank and they say, yeah, you can put your money here, but we're going to charge you to put your money here. And by the way, we have a history of going bankrupt. And then you go to another bank and they say, well, we're not going to charge you anything, but we're not going to pay you any interest either. And by the way, we have a history of going bankrupt. And then you go to the other one, they say, yeah, we'll not only guarantee your money and give you insurance against it, but we will also pay you a higher rate. Oh, and by the way, we have the biggest markets in the world. Oh, and by the way, we have the biggest military to defend ourselves. Which bank are you going to put your money in? And that's why I think the global capital is going to flow here. It's not because we are in great shape, but it's just because everybody else is even worse. And so, like I said, if Fed keeps raising rates, this divergence of the U.S. having a higher rate than the rest of the world becomes even bigger and will only intensify. And even if they have to eventually loosen, it will be because the whole world is in a deflationary move or in a slowdown. And so the rest of the world will have to loosen even more. And so this will lead to increased capital flows around the world back into the U.S. and to the U.S. markets. And I still think the U.S. will be seen as the cleanest dirty shirt amongst the world's central banks. I believe this will become a vicious cycle, drawing in even more capital flows, and what I believe will end up being a currency crisis and a sovereign bond crisis. And this is where I get to some cognitive dissonance when I talk to people, or when I see cognitive dissonance when I talk to some people who don't agree with me that the dollar is going to go higher. But I will start to see them argue with themselves because they're convinced that the dollar is going to fall, But then they will admit that in some type of a crisis or in some kind of a volatile event, yeah, the dollar might go up for a short while before turning back down. But that's kind of the whole point. There is going to be a crisis. If you think that there's not going to be a crisis, well, good luck. But there is going to be a crisis, and when the world is moving, and while the world is moving towards de-dollarization, it hasn't happened yet. And until it is, when the crisis comes, the dollar is going to be seen as the safe haven. Now, maybe it'll only take for a few weeks, maybe a few months, but the pain that it will cause to the rest of the world when this happens is enormous. So I wouldn't want to have all my money over there and have no money here when that takes place. So I really just don't understand how you can think that the U.S. is going to be in a crisis, but also think the dollar is faced with its imminent demise. But for some reason, many people I speak to just cannot let the idea go of the U.S. dollar entering a hyperinflationary bonfire, which will destroy the currency and the U.S. empire along with it. Maybe it's because it's been suggested to us so many times and for so many years and decades now that many people just can't let it go. This has become what many people expect to see, and therefore they see it. I mean, the dollar just has to fall, right? Well, if this is your belief, are you sure? Are you certain? And if you're certain, is this the result of much vigorous contemplation of the facts, or as laid out by Dr. Burton, is your certainty an involuntary brain mechanism that, like love or anger, functions independently of reason? In The Crack-Up, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Now, arguing with yourself and holding two competing thoughts may be a sign of a great intellect, but it can also drive you mad. So if you had to choose, you have to ask yourself, would you rather be informed or would you rather remain sane? Because the truth is often much scarier than the lie. I'll wrap up this presentation in the same way that Burton wrapped up his book. And it's a quote from David Goss, who was a 2004 Nobel Prize winner in physics, so he's not exactly a stupid guy. He said, and I quote, "The most important product of knowledge is ignorance." I couldn't have said it better myself. In any event, I hope I've spurred you on to do some thinking. I encourage you to challenge some of your own assumptions and then come to your own conclusions. Feel free to challenge mine, because I don't claim to have all the answers. And I'm certainly not trying to cause any pain. After all, I wouldn't even harm a fly. Thank you. Thanks.